Hey everyone, I'm Bertil Auris. The Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Booster Course Pass is now officially halfway completed. Released way back in March earlier this year, 6 waves are set to release accordingly until the end of 2023. And now we're at the end of 2022 with half of these waves released. It's been an amazing journey thus far. That Mario Kart 8 Deluxe would get its content doubled in size 5 years after its release was only a shower thought for most people until the February Direct this year, but it happened, and it's still going on. So I thought, let's take a look at all of the currently released 24 courses and compare them to each other by ranking them all on this tier list I made. And to my help, I have 3 very good friends and content creators who will help me out with this. Introducing the Plus Void.
Hey guys, it's Tricky Nick here.
What is up, you guys? It is ZakPak.
G'day folks, it's Swiftjar here.
With all that being said, let's get started.
Hey, you forgot about me. Albert Boring!
Oh dear, Bertil Auris, my evil twin brother. Of course you had to interrupt my video. Unfortunately, we didn't ask for your presence. Get out! Anyways, the tier list I'll be using is divided into the following classes: S, A, B, C, D and F. We'll start off with the F tier, which includes any course that's bad or just downright awful. These are the tracks that I simply don't like to play on at all and have little redeeming qualities. Luckily, none of the tracks in the Booster Course Pass are actually that bad. So in either case, we're immediately gonna jump to the next tier, D. This one is gonna be for courses that aren't bad, but they're not particularly good either. They might be enjoyable to a smaller extent, but on the whole, I'd rather not have anything to do with them at all, and 3DS Toad Circuit is perhaps the biggest offender of this. Out of all the tracks, this one is easily the most dull. Since it was released all the way back in Wave 1, it graphically looks much weaker compared to other tracks in this DLC, resulting in a rather bland and washed out atmosphere. Gameplay-wise, it is one of the better opening tracks in the series, but that bar is pretty low since although we have a glider ramp, balloon decorations and nifty shortcuts, it's still pretty basic with not a lot of things to do. But I mean, that was obvious. But Toad Circuit isn't the only circuit course in the Booster Course Pass so far. Another one that was added for Wave 2 was SNES Mario Circuit 3. A bit of a boring track to bring back, when the other SNES Mario circuits would have been way more interesting, but it's a fine course nevertheless. In a nutshell, it's kind of the opposite to 3DS Toad Circuit. It's much more pleasing visually, and the track design is more fun to play around with far more turns and shortcuts. Aesthetically though, it's a bit more boring with not a whole lot going on. I mean, Toad Circuit at least had a glider ramp and balloons. But I digress, since it's not that bad and the gameplay is at least slightly more ambitious. And those were the 2 circuits, by name at least. There is actually one more track in the Booster Course Pass that mildly resembles them too, which will also accompany them in the D tier. And that is the first city track on my ranking, Tokyo Blur. The city tracks are my favorite aspect of the DLC. It's cool enough that we can explore real-life cities, but the fact that every lap has a different route brings a completely new gameplay gimmick that's always interesting to see how they'll handle. Alas, Tokyo Blur is pretty disappointing though. Unlike the other city tracks that do a lot to stand out culturally and aesthetically, this one is rather basic in its approach, as it really just follows a random trafficless highway, with an incredibly basic soundtrack and boring layout at that. I like the gliding at the end, and that's about it. Luckily, those were the only tracks in the D tier. Starting off with the C tier, all the tracks will at least be above average. Although these tracks in particular might still have a lot of flaws that prevent me from fully enjoying them. Opening up this tier, we have Wee Coconut Mall. I'll pass over the script to my good friend and content creator Tricky Nick here, who will describe the changes made to this track.
Thanks, Albert. Coconut Mall, which hails from Mario Kart Wii, got a remake unlike any other track. Aesthetics, colors, gameplay, nearly everything had been altered. The mall's interior is more saturated now, and many of the assets like the flooring, escalators, and stairs have received new textures. Not necessarily better. Even the ending section has been changed, as cars now driven by Shy Guys will only make a donut spin every now and then, instead of going back and forth.
Thank you, Tricky Nick. Unfortunately, as you hinted, these changes are for the worse in my opinion. For me, the charm about this track was how realistic it felt in Mario Kart Wii. That version really made you feel like you were in a mall, but unfortunately, with this much more cartoony approach, it doesn't really feel like a mall anymore, which kinda ruins the point of it. Even gameplay-wise, it's much easier and more shallow now, since the cars are a lot easier to avoid and there's no boost panels to make it more exciting. In the end, it's still Coconut Mall kind of, it's still cool to drive around in, but it's a shell of its former self. Another shell of its former self is GBA Sky Garden. Likewise, its gameplay and assets were changed, but to an even more radical degree, as the layout isn't even the same anymore. Not even slightly, they effectively cut out a third from it. However, I do prefer it to Coconut Mall, because on the other hand, they did at least improve the atmosphere as a compensation. It's still too short, but it's pretty fun while it lasts, with a really epic soundtrack, a nice progression upwards, and a cool gliding section at the end. It still feels like Sky Garden, can't say the same for Coconut Mall. Next up is another Sky themed course, Sky High Sunday, our first unlabeled track. These effectively act as original Nitro tracks in both Mario Kart Tour and 8 Deluxe, with the missing labels and all. And Sky High Sunday in fact even debuted in this game before Tour. And this track? It's okay. I like to think that this track is taking place somewhere far above Sweet Sweet Canyon. That's why the entire track is in anti-gravity, because the gravity is just much weaker up here. It and the multiple tricks and ramps add a lot of personality to an otherwise rather basic oval, and the atmosphere is just absolute chaos. Alas, it's still pretty basic, so it won't be any higher than this. Now, before we get to the next course on this list, we interrupt with a brand new trailer for the Mario Kart 8 Deluxe Shroom Gorge Pass. Race on at least 3 of Albert Boris' favorite courses of all time in the green forested canyons of these tracks. But there is a catch. The visuals that made these tracks pop out are long gone. Yeah, this is basically a collective term I coined for these 3 tracks, and possibly many more to come. I love tracks that are set in nature, especially if there's a lot of green and forests involved. Unfortunately, all of the tracks in the Booster Course Pass with these traits got the short end of the stick graphically. Even 3 waves in, with a more plastic and basic art style compared to other tracks. DS Shroom Ridge from Wave 1 got the shortest end of the stick. Gameplay wise, it's still the same fun Shroom Ridge it was in Mario Kart DS, with the calm highways setting in the mountains. Unfortunately, this was also a track that was highly dependent on its charming visuals, and with those gone, it can't go much higher than this unfortunately. It just looks so fake and so plastic now. And I'm normally a gameplay over graphics guy. Well, at least the added shortcuts makes it still relatively fun, I guess. Next up is GBA Boo Lake, which is kind of the opposite to Shroom Ridge. This was a track I never really cared for in Super Circuit, since it was pretty forgettable and basic in both aesthetics and layouts. But then it's got one of the biggest glow-ups out of any DLC track, both aesthetically with the added lake, but also gameplay-wise with the more tilted layout and anti-gravity. It's still pretty short, but I still had more fun with the little I had in this compared to the rather lacking DS Shroom Ridge. I swear, if Shroom Ridge at least looked decent, it could have been B tier. And speaking of which, the B tier is up next. The C tier was a collection of slightly above average tracks. Even Coconut Mall was okay to an extent. The B tier, however, is where we'll be starting to see courses that are actually good and quite fun to play on. Starting off with 3DS Alpine Pass.
3DS Rock Mountain.
No, Alpine Pass.
No, Rock Mountain.
Seriously, that's the most boring possible name for a course where rock only make up a small section. Whereas Alpine Pass better represents the fact that it's a trail on an alpine mountain range. And it's a cool reference to the real-life Alpine Pass in Switzerland. Anyways, where were I? Oh yeah, 3DS Alpine Pass is a good course. Sadly, it is yet another victim of the plastic art style as part of the Shroom Gorge Pass, as while the original track was filled with lush green forests, the remake looks more like clay. However, the visuals aren't nearly as awful, and don't distract me from the track too much. And gameplay wise, it was always much more interesting than Shroom Ridge, which puts it many spots above it, with the abundant gliding and steeper difficulty. It doesn't make it S tier, but it barely passed the C tier, an overall good track. Following that, we have our second unlabeled track, Merry Mountain. Allow me to pass over the script to my good friend Swiftjar, who will describe the track's positives.
Thanks so much for that, Albert. As some of you guys know, Merry Mountain is one of my favourite courses of all time. It is simply magical from start to finish. To start off with, it perhaps has one of the best presentations out of any Mario Kart track in the entire series. It's set at sunset, but it's completely lit up by Christmas lights, candles, and the full moon in the starry sky. The music has a really jolly and epic vibe to it as well. Merry Mountain's course layout is purely magical, and with its enhanced graphics in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, our eyes are in for a frosty treat. What's even more exciting is that it features anti-gravity and half-pipes. But that isn't all, as it has a fun branching pathway and even a gliding section that opens up on the second lap, or the third lap if you're playing on 200cc. Overall, I just love everything about Merry Mountain, and I believe it's the perfect Christmas winter wonderland. And I'm sure Bertil Auris would definitely agree with me. That's why he's my favourite.
Thank you, Swiftjar. It is truly a magical track. Unfortunately, for all it's worth, it is on the short side, and the design feels a bit ovular, which results in the track feeling slightly underwhelming, especially since some parts could be more evolved on, like the slope at the end, which is a little too long and has too little going on. Following that, we have the other winter-themed track, GBA Snowland, which ironically enough debuted in Wave 2 instead of 3, in spite of the theme. Now, out of the 3 GBA remakes in the Booster Course Pass so far, I think this one is easily the best. It was a faithful remake unlike Sky Garden, and unlike Boo Lake, it's longer and has more going on, so it leaves a stronger impression. Yeah, in spite of the underwater section in Boo Lake. Sure, on the surface, it's a bit mellow, and the atmosphere is pretty calm and there aren't any drastic sections, but it doesn't really matter since the atmosphere is perfect enough with the elevation we have and the beautiful new park setting. And that's not mentioning how it has one of the craziest shortcuts in the entire game, which adds a completely new perspective to the track. So yeah, GBA Snowland. Simply the most pleasant GBA remake so far. Following Snowland, we have Tour New York Minute, our next city track on this list. Admittedly, when Wave 2 was first released, I would have probably ranked this course way higher on the list, maybe in the top 5. I absolutely adored playing it on release, with the cozy nighttime setting, superb visuals, and more. However, I've realized afterwards that was also mostly just the hype of finally being able to play Wave 2 after nearly 5 months of wait. In reality, it's just a good course. I do find it a little too simple to be any higher, since a lot of it is just straight roads, and the first and second laps are both kinda short with not much going on. But I digress, the amazing atmosphere makes up for it. Up next, we have N64 Chaco Mountain. Now this track is a bit of a special place in my heart. When Wave 1 was first released, this course stood out because out of all the classic retro tracks, this was the only one where they actually improved the gameplay and visuals. Yes, the only one. The textures were much closer to the base game, and they even changed some areas to be more interesting, like the tunnel and new glider section. It was a fun and charming track in Mario Kart 64, and it's still just as fun. However, now that Waves 2 and 3 are also out, I'm able to see it from a more objective perspective, with more tracks than just this one looking good now. And I mean, it would be unfair to rank it above some of the even better tracks that also have good visuals, so I think this is a more fair spot for it. And for the final course in the B tier, we have the banger that is Tour Berlin Byways. Well, okay, it is admittedly overrated. Whereas most people would probably rank it somewhere in the top 5, it stays at 11th place for me. Sure, the music is absolutely amazing, although I prefer the original tune in Mario Kart Tour, but the track itself does fall a bit on the basic side. Aesthetically, it's simply not as interesting as other city tracks. I mean, take a look at the entirety of Lap 2 if you will. It's just a normal highway. On the other hand, when it does shine, it's usually really good, like the last lap where you can literally trick off of Womps in their first Mario Kart appearance. And the transition between laps is pulled off incredibly well. Now if it was night themed, it would have been much higher. So yeah, Berlin Byways will close off the B tier. And now we get to the A tier. This tier comprises tracks that aren't just good, but quite amazing in fact. The only thing that separates them from the S tier is the fact that they still have a number of flaws that you could point to, which unfortunately leaves a small stain on them. But on the whole, I have an amazing time playing these tracks, and opening up the top 10, we have DS Waluigi Pinball. It is crazy. They took a relatively bland and overrated track from Mario Kart DS and actually gave it justice, as it's brimming with tight and colorful turns and difficult hazards. Really, the only thing that's sinking this one is the lack of any shortcuts at all and the fact that I wish it took place more on the pinball area rather than its slide. And even the pinball area is a bit bloated, but hey, it's still amazing fun. And just as fun is Waluigi's predecessor in the Turnip Cup, N64 Kalimari Desert. Honestly, the N64 tracks are simply the best remakes in the Booster Course Pass. Choco Mountain was a great remake already, and this is even more pleasant. It was a really boring course in the original game, as it was really just an empty and over-glorified loop, where a train occasionally passed by. But now that you for the last 2 laps actually get to drive on the train tracks, it changes the entire thing. Not only is the train a much bigger hazard now, but it's also much repetitive when you get to do different things each lap, and the visuals are just perfect. But the alternating laps gimmick wouldn't have been possible if the first track ever in the DLC didn't pull it off so well, Tour Paris Promenade. Even though it was the first track of the entire Booster Course Pass, it still holds up incredibly well. It started with the alternating laps gimmick, and it introduced us to it in the best possible way. The first 2 laps are the same, but they're incredibly varied nevertheless, with many branching pathways, and overall just a really charming atmosphere. And then the third lap has you driving backwards, which made for an incredibly nice change of pace. Most Wave 1 tracks do feel kinda ugly and devolved looking back, but this one was always incredibly beautiful in its visuals, which clearly made this one of the highlights, and to this day it's still amazing. Following that is Wee Mushroom Gorge. Out of the 3 courses in the so-called Shroom Gorge Pass, this one came out on top, and when you actually play the track, it's not so difficult to see why. My friend ZakPak here will go over why.
Thanks, Albert. Mushroom Gorge, despite its simpler art style compared to other Booster Course Pass tracks, makes up completely in its gameplay. It takes the best aspects from both Mario Kart Wii and Mario Kart 7's renditions of this track. For Mario Kart 7 returns the blue mushroom platforms that activate your glider, and for Mario Kart Wii returns the 2 nifty shortcuts. Yes, both the hidden trampolines at the start and the massive gap jump at the end. Aesthetically, there's also a lot more going on within the setting itself, so you don't notice all the small details like you do in Shroom Ridge and Rock Mountain. Not to mention, it's just a really fun course in general.
It's Alpine Pass, but yes, thank you ZakPak.
Rock Mountain!
Bro Bertil, can you just leave, please? I will never not call it Alpine Pass. Now for number 6, we possibly have one of the most special tracks for me, Tour London Loop. Now, I don't think it's the best city track, however it is the track that fills me with the most joy. It's always been a guilty pleasure of mine back in Mario Kart Tour, and it's even better now. I think out of all the city tracks, it has one of the best routes. The first lap is slightly basic, but cool enough with even an alternate route. The second lap is also really fun, but the third lap is perfection, since it basically combines a part of the second lap, a part of the first lap, and some new pathways. But what makes it all the more epic is the fact that all of the chain chomps gets loose on it, so you basically get to experience snippets of the first 2 laps but in a more chaotic setting. It's just such a beautiful progression, which is only amplified by my favorite song in the Booster Course Pass so far. It is absolutely kingly. This track just makes me happy. Actually even more so than the next track on this tier list, Wee Maple Treeway, which opens up the top 5. It was this close to being S tier. The visuals and music are just beautiful. I don't think it needs explaining, it's just perfect. And the track itself is also incredibly fun to drive on, with the twisty layout and the better use of half pipes compared to Merry Mountain. Now, if only they kept the bridge. And now, we only have the S tier left. The best of the best. These following 4 courses are all practically flawless, and even if they aren't, whatever problems they do have are so trivial that it's ultimately not noticeable in the sea of amazing things. Opening up with the so far best city track in the DLC, Tour Sydney Sprint. I think it's only right that an Australian should discuss this track, so once again, I'm passing over the script to Swiftjar.
Thanks again, Albert. Sydney Sprint is a very interesting track. One of the most interesting aspects of it is how realistic the layout to Sydney is in real life. You only need to go to Google Earth, look up Sydney, and trace out the routes to see how accurate it actually is. Despite Uluru, you can't quite see that from Sydney. Sydney Sprint has a tropical and climactic vibe to it, which makes for an incredibly satisfying experience, and it's very complemented by the catchy soundtrack as well. Despite being the only city track without any hazards, the track design makes up for it. Whether you're driving through the twisty Barangaroo, taking one of the epic gliders at the Opera House, or tricking off ramps at the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Sure, there are some parts that feel a little bit empty, but together, the layout makes it simply an amazing experience.
Thank you again, Swiftjar. Starting off the top 3, we have 3DS Rainbow Road, the epic finale to the first half of the DLC. It is perhaps the most ambitious Rainbow Road we have ever seen in the series, with the much bigger soundtrack, the sections dividing up the track, and even having you drive on other extraterrestrial objects like the rings of Saturn and the moon. And for once, we're actually driving on a rainbow instead of rainbow-colored metal. Now yeah, the track is a bit on the short side and the music could be more calming, but it's got enough going on that it hardly matters. Right next we have DS Peach Gardens, which barely beat it out for Best Wave Free track. In Mario Kart DS and Wii, it was always a really solid and underrated track, with the exciting calm before storm vibes, and really fun maze-like layouts. On the surface, this remake does appear to be more mellow, as a few sections have been dumbed down. But I don't think it's so big of an issue that it ruins the atmosphere, which is still as cool as it can be, especially with the added violin in the music. And then it completely flips the table when you start driving backwards for the final lap in Paris Promenade style. Like, I did not expect that to happen at all, but I love it! They took an already great track and barely made it the best track in the entire DLC. However, the best track in the DLC will be hard to top. It's funny honestly. For all the hate Wave 1 gets and will get in the future, and despite it's most likely going to end up being the worst wave of the bunch, it might, after all this time in spite of this, have the best track in the entire Booster Course Pass, Ninja Hideaway. It's not just the best DLC track, it's one of the best Mario Kart courses of all time. You know why if you've played it. It's crazy. The track design is just perfect with so many different gadgets and hazards to look out for, so many twisty turns, and so many alternate pathways. In fact, at all times, you basically have a lower and higher floor of the track, which makes for so much variety since you can also choose if you want to go down a level. And that's not mentioning the many shortcuts this track also has. And thematically, it's also just really interesting since you're exploring a massive ninja temple in the spring night. It's honestly a much more interesting representation of Japan than Tokyo Blur, and I doubt any track from Wave 4 to 6 will even top it.
No, that opinion's just wrong. Ninja Hideaway is way too difficult and way too chaotic. You barely get any time to breathe. It's all over the place.
Well, to be fair, it is your opinion, but don't tell me this track is bad.
Tokyo Blur is so much better. It has much nicer flow, and it doesn't act like it's so unique and cool.
And that was everything Bertil Auris had to say. And my tier list for the first 24 courses of the Booster Course Pass so far. I'm gonna redo this list the next year, once all 48 tracks are out, and who knows, maybe my opinion will change on some of these tracks in the meantime. Kinda like how New York Minute and Mushroom Gorge swapped places since release. And before we end this video, I need to give a shout out to Swiftjar, ZakPak and Tricky Nick, who helped me out with this video. Make sure to check out their YouTube channels as well. They're kingly. But yeah, what is your ranking of the first 24 courses of the Booster Course Pass? If you like this video then, please make sure to like, share and subscribe to my channel, as I talk about nearly everything Mario related. With all of that being said, I am now departing. Until next time.